Hello, everyone, and welcome to Always Choose Orange, the show that provides actionable ways to develop and maintain a thriving creative process. I'm your host, Alex Acanero, and today's guest is Kate Woodman. Kate is a commercial photographer specializing in conceptual and narrative imagery. A structural engineer by trade, Kate made the jump to photography after a work transfer to New Zealand got her interested in shooting landscapes, and things spiraled from there. 10 years into her professional career, Kate shoots everything from pharma to fashion and all things in between. Kate is based in Portland, Oregon, and when she's not photographing, she's teaching color theory and putting her engineering degree to work by renovating her mid-century home. Kate, welcome to the show.
Hey Alex, thanks for having me.
So, I want to delve into your creative process and how your ideas come to you and how you take something from like an idea to sort of the finish. But the place I want to start is kind of with a fun specific question. So,
Yeah.
I'll give you a little bit of context before I ask it. So I took 3 years of art in high school, and then I ended up taking some art in community college. And one of the things they always had us do in all these art classes was take like charcoal or pencil and do these still lifes. So put all these glass on the table and do flowers or things like that. And it was so hard for me. Like portraits were my jam, all that stuff, and still lifes. I just never understood them. They drove me crazy. So when I first discovered your work and I saw on your website the unstill lives, I thought that was so awesome and just like what you put together for those spreads and stuff like that. So the place I wanted to start was if you could just talk about what inspired the unstill lives and what you were kind of thinking and what those were exercises in.
Yeah, totally. So Unstill Ice was actually my COVID project. So, like I had just come from a job for Airbnb in like February 2019. And then like I went to go visit a friend in Albuquerque and like a day after I got back, like the whole world shut down. So I was like, well, crap, now like what am I gonna what am I gonna shoot? I can't like even talk to people at this point. I can't engage with them physically. I can't shoot models. So like I needed something creative so that I wouldn't lose my mind. And it really, as most of my projects I think start out, came from like what do I have available to me right now? And I think I'm trying to remember which was the first one that I did, but I think it might have been I did like a triadic one. So it was like a blue background and a bunch of like red, blue, and yellow things that I had in my house. And I literally just like went through my garage. It was like, what things of color will work for this like color composition? And then I literally just like my dining room table, put up a backdrop, brought everything in, and just started kind of like playing around with composition. And I probably sat there for, I don't know, it was probably 2 days of just like trying something, moving it around, adjusting lighting, and just like really like experimenting and having fun with it. Was certainly not like oh, I have this perfect idea in my head of what this is going to look like. It was really just like, let's just get stuff together and see what happens. And then the project kind of spiraled from there. And there's always this element of like I love traditional aesthetics. I love like that kind of classic painterly style, but for me, the exciting part about photography is bringing in this kind of conceptual element. So the project kind of evolved into like, how can I take this thing and make it look kind of classical in its aesthetic, but also add something weird to it or add something that like feels a little more contemporary or, just something that like wouldn't be typically seen in a historical like composition. And yeah, I think I probably have, I don't know, like 6 or 7 of those at this point. Um, and once we started being able to shoot people again, I kind of stopped doing as much of the still life stuff. But like I mean, I have like 25 other ideas that I would love to continue with that at some point. So who knows, maybe I'll get back to it eventually.
So did you do them sort of within the same time period? Were you interspersing other stuff in between, or were you like locked in on those?
I think initially, um, that was kind of like the primary thing that I was shooting. And then I think they did maybe one or two after, the world started opening back up again. Um, but yeah, I think at that point, like the idea had kind of run its course for the time being. I tend to be like a bit ADHD when it comes to my concepts and ideas and stuff. So it's like I'll do one thing and then I'm like, okay, I've done that. What
Yeah.
can I do that's completely different from this and move on to something that's like just reinventing the wheel every time I shoot something. So yeah, my creative interest in a certain thing kind of goes for like a short spurt and then it's like, okay, now we got to move on to something else.
Well, it's like the perfect, I feel like, field for that though, because you can just explore all the different sort of pockets of photography and stuff. What is your spread of projects like the Unstill Lifes or things like that that you're doing for yourself because you have these creative ideas versus I know you also work heavily in the commercial space, so people are, looking for certain, whether it's advertisements or whatever it is that they're looking for. Like, what does that spread kind of end up looking like typically?
Like I said, for me, it's like reinventing the wheel every time. And I sometimes I genuinely wish I could be that photographer that's like, I only shoot portraits, I only shoot this, or like this is my kind of go-to lighting style. But honestly, like for me, uh, eh, I'm inspired by all different things. And so the stuff that I tend to shoot personally is like it's all over the place. It is still lifes. It is, generally it involves people in locations. But sometimes it's just like weird studio character portraits or something super simple. And sometimes it's bringing someone to a crazy location and then a whole story kind of evolves out of that. I would say generally the through line through all of my personal stuff is narrative and conceptual. But that those are such broad categories that I think like I'm kind of allowed to put anything and everything sort of in those boxes. So I really do like to shoot a pretty wide variety of things in my personal work.
So, with that being said, how do your ideas typically come to you? Are you seeking out inspiration? Are you driving down the street and all of a sudden, oh, I want to, shoot at this gas station? Like, what typically, how does that typically work?
It's all of it. It's all of the things. Sometimes I wish I could shut my brain off because it's overwhelming at times. But it's like, I mean, it literally is everything that's all around me. I mean, I did a photo shoot years and years ago with a guy in a suit in a hot tub, and that the inspiration from that came from like a friend's Instagram post where he like accidentally fell in the hot tub at a New Year's Eve party. And I'm like, that's great. Let's make a fashion story about it. Um, Sometimes it's like I see a really cool location, and like that will like create a whole narrative that kind of comes out of that space. Or sometimes it's like I test with models with local agencies, and every once in a while they'll send out like new faces. So sometimes it's just, I see a new model and I'm like, oh, I haven't worked with this person. They have a really interesting look. Their look looks like it could lend itself well to this sort of thing. Um, so the ideas kind of come from everywhere, it's Instagram, it's Pinterest, it's like seeing really pretty light on a house in my neighborhood. I mean, it can be literally anything. And I, being the former structural engineer type A nerd that I am, I have lists of everything. So anytime I see something that like sparks any kind of idea, and it doesn't have to be like a thought out idea, it's just like, oh, this was something that sparked my interest. I write it down. My notes list on my phone is insane. You should see
Oh,
it. Like it just keeps scrolling and it never stops. Um, and then so I have like that, and then I have then I have an Excel spreadsheet
yeah.
which has all of those things that are kind of like potentially hashed out a little bit in a little bit more detail. Um, so yeah, it usually kind of starts with something very like nebulous or basic or something that happened on a whim, and then as kind of a secondary part to that, I let it sit, I let it marinate, and then there's more of a strategic conscious, like creative ideation process that comes after that. So it's like, okay, well, here's this thing that's interesting. Like here's the space that's interesting. Let's sit with that for a minute and like kind of start brainstorming what a story would look like and kind of thinking about all of the pieces that would have to go together to make it happen. So that's kind of the general thought process and the the way that I find inspiration, kind of take it from there.
And when so you have all the ideas in the spreadsheet and you're sort of letting them sit, what has you pull an idea back out? Are you just recalling, oh, I want to go pursue that idea, or do you set aside time and sort of look through it and sort of decide what you want to do that way?
It's a good question. I think it depends on what my bandwidth is at the moment. Like if I have some downtime, winter is usually really nice because it tends to be a little bit less busy. So that's a time where I really will kind of dedicate some like thinking time to what are these ideas and how can I kind of like hash them out. But I think there are a couple things. One is like, what do I need now from a career perspective, right? Like, what are my goals in my career in terms of clients that I'm trying to pursue? And then which of these ideas that I have in this list kind of align with that? And so, how do I kind of take those ideas and make it something that is maybe a type of spec work or something that is just kind of going in the direction of something that I need? And like maybe I've been shooting a lot of really like dark, dramatic stuff, and maybe I need something that's a little bit brighter and lighter. So that's kind of one way that that kind of happens. And then sometimes it's just like, what do I feel is something I'm capable of doing with the resources I have currently? And there are ideas that have been on that list for 6, 7, 8 years that like I still would absolutely love to do, and my mind keeps getting drawn back to it, but it's a production and it's a lot of work. And I'm like, I don't know if this is the right time to kind of invest in that.
Yeah.
So let's look at ideas that I have that are feasible on a low budget. The scope isn't that big. So yeah, those are kind of the thought processes of like why I'm choosing which ideas to execute and when.
Once you have the idea and you decided that you're going to execute it, what does your pre-production process look like? Do you sketch things out? Do you start visualizing in your head? Are you picking out colors? Yeah, what kind of comes next after you're like, okay, I got this idea, I need to set this up. Yeah, walk us through that a little bit.
Yeah, I could literally talk for like an hour on this, so I'll try to keep it as high level as possible. But um, I think the first thing is kind of getting all of the scope sort of sorted out. So what do I need for the shoot? I need talent, I need wardrobe, I need hair and makeup, I need a location. Um, some of those things are pretty easy. I have like kind of a go-to team that I work with specifically for hair and makeup that I know I can like call them up and be like, hey, can you help me with this? And they're like, yep, totally. Just name the time and place. Talent is generally fairly easy unless I'm looking for like a very specific thing. And like I said, sometimes it starts with the talent. So, maybe that's kind of the jumping off point. Um, a lot of stuff I do myself. I do a lot of styling myself. I've done a ton of set builds. I do a lot of location scouting. I mean, when especially when you're starting out, right? You're kind of a one person team. So you kind of have to rely only on yourself to get these resources sorted. Um, and so yeah, there's a lot of that. And it's a lot of, it's essentially you're your own producer at that point and kind of juggling all of these things. Um, so yeah, that's kind of where it starts for pre-production. And then depending on the concept, um, if I'm shooting in an existing location, I'll try to get there physically beforehand to scout, maybe like take some location photos just to kind of get a sense of like composition and that helps me sort of develop what the narrative is going to be, if it is going to be a narrative, or even if it's a single shot, just kind of getting an assessment of like what that space looks like. I am very much a visual person and like a 3D visual person, so I really need to like be in a space to really like have a sense of what I need to do to make the image work. Um, if I'm doing like a set build or I'm decorating a space or something like that, I will oftentimes like pull up SketchUp or Blender and start kind of building something out three-dimensionally there. Because I do this all the time for commercial work as well. If I ever do like set builds during the treatment, I'll start kind of this pre-viz process essentially. Um, because it really helps me kind of wrap my brain around what this is going to look like, how I'm going to make it work. Um, Sometimes like I'll get really crazy and start like modeling lights out in Blender, which is a whole thing.
Mhm.
It's the nerd in me, it's the engineer in me. I love it. I'm obsessed with it.
That's awesome.
And it's nice because you don't have to like, pre-light in the same way because you already kind of have a sense of like what,
Mm.
you can do that digitally so you can kind of come into set kind of knowing what that's going to look like. Yeah, and then honestly, sometimes the hardest part is just getting everyone to show up at the same time in
Mm.
the same place, which can like juggling people's schedules can be really challenging. But yeah, I think that's kind of high level my general pre-production process.
How much of your shoot then from that point, right? That's a lot of prep work and a lot of thought and a lot of coordinating schedules and all that. How much then from that point, especially of like the actual layout of the images, how much of that is planned and then how much do you sort of improvise? Now, I know obviously you're going in with like a vision and all that stuff, but are there moments where you get surprised by, okay, now that we're in the spot and we have the people here, this is actually
Oh,
turning
for
out way
sure.
different?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I am type A. I definitely love having a plan. But I also know that you can't anticipate everything, and sometimes the best stuff happens when you're in the space and it's like magic happens. You get the right pose or you hadn't thought of a certain angle, and then you're there and you're like, "Oh, let's adjust this." And I think leaving space to do that is super valuable. I think, especially in personal work where you have the opportunity to be a little bit more playful and to be able to experiment more, that's really critical. Um, for me, it runs the gamut. I have shoots that everything is kind of detailed to a T because I have a very specific idea in mind of what I want it to look like. And then have always done and still do shoots where I show up and it's like a makeup artist and it's a model and we literally haven't even picked out outfits.
Okay.
This just happened this past Thursday. I had an actor who was in town reach out and she was like, let's get together, let's shoot something. It was fairly short notice, managed to find someone to do hair and makeup, and we opened up this closet behind me, which was just full of wardrobe for shoots and played dress up and then we just like came up with this like ridiculous 60s unhinged housewife story that we shot in like yeah, I think we got like four different looks over the course of 3 or 4 hours. And I love doing that because A, it gives me freedom to just mess around without any expectations, but B keeps me super sharp from a problem solving
Mm.
perspective. Because, nothing is ever going to go 100% to plan. And if you have that expectation and you show up and things don't go to plan, and then you aren't prepared to be able to pivot and to adjust and find a way to make something work. So I think that if you're photographing and it doesn't matter if you're just shooting portraits against a backdrop, just like being able to be playful and experiment and try different things is so valuable. And I don't think that, I'm 10 years into this. Like it's still just as important for me to do this. Like I don't know everything there is to know about all of the aspects of photography. Um, and it's just practice and it's keeping skills honed.
Do you ever consciously look at your work and then sort of analyze it and then say, "Oh, I want to do some experimentation down." I don't know what a good example would be, but some sort of skill set, and you say, "I'm going to experiment with to develop this skill set." Do you still kind of like, train yourself, I guess, in like different aspects of photography, like intentionally?
Yeah, totally, 100%. And I think like I was saying before, like I have an attention span for one thing and then it kind of shifts direction, and that I mean that applies here certainly. And it manifests in different ways too. Like sometimes it's like focusing on how can we light things differently than I
Hmm.
have been lighting. And sometimes it's like, okay, conceptually, the stuff that I tend to do is focused on this type of character or this kind of emotion. Like, how do I mix that up and do something different? Like, I think for years I was focusing on shooting sad, beautiful women in like dark, dramatic spaces. And like I love doing that. And I will always probably go back to that. But it's like, okay, I've done that. So let's let's flip it around. And like the last couple of years, I've been photographing a ton of kids,
Hmm.
and doing stuff that's a little bit more um, like light and bright and still conceptual, but just kind of a different tact. And that means a shift in talent, but it also means a shift in aesthetics and trying out different techniques and trying out different locations. Um, and yeah, like right now, I'm really excited about working with uh, actors and people who aren't, your traditional fashion models, because that's an avenue that I haven't really pursued as much.
Okay.
And it's something that's being asked more of me in my commercial work,
Okay.
working with like real talent and working with, people who are older or people who are, diverse in their aesthetics. And, I think it's important to be able to represent all different types of people in the work and to devise stories that fit all different types of people, not just the pretty sad girls.
Right. Yeah. How much are you, because your work, like you said, is so narrative and conceptual, and that's like something that I love about it and that's super striking about it. How much are you developing these narratives? So are you thinking up whole backstories in your head? Are you just saying it feels like this type of character? Like I'm super curious as to like how you develop these narratives and like form that strong of a visual sort of scene.
There are certain stories that are very thought out, and it's like you think of it in terms of how you would approach writing a story, right? So you have exposition, you have kind of this sort of introductory shot that sets the mood, and then you have these like plot elements that kind of carry the story along, and then you have a climax, and then you have a resolution. So when you think about narrative visually, it follows the same kind of rubric that you would use in writing.
Yeah.
Um, but it's just kind of a different manifestation of it, I guess. And I think like I'm very much influenced by film and cinematography and that sort of thing. So if you think about a narrative photo series as like if you took your favorite movie and you were like, okay, you have 8 images, you have 8 stills from this movie, and you have to distill it down to these 8 images to like convey the essence of this film. That's kind of my approach to narrative stories. It's like what is the salient information I can get in each of these shots that's going to get you like from beginning to end.
I love that so much. I'm super into, so I'm like a writer is like my main form of art. And so I'm constantly thinking about narrative and stuff like that. So I love that. Are you matching like, so you were talking about matching to like the different sort of beats of the story and stuff like that. Are you matching stuff like one to one in the sense of like, okay, here's my, like you said, like the intro, here's the rising action, are you sort of thinking like that specific and like mapping photos one to one, or are you thinking more just the general shape, and mapping out
Yeah.
that way?
Yeah, I would say more the general shape. I certainly have done projects that are much more literal in terms of that process and that path. But I think the beauty of visuals is that you can be really flexible in that regard. And also you can tell a story, like a full narrative in a single frame.
Hmm.
So what are how do you kind of capture all of those components and condense that down? In a way that you can't execute that in writing, or you can't do it in cinema because you need, all these different frames. So yeah, I mean it depends, but I think in general it's more just like an approximation of that rather than a sort of a literal interpretation of it.
Are when you're doing sort of that like narrative series work, because I've seen, some of them like the War Widow one stands out to me with like the way you use color throughout that series where like it kind of changes to match like the emotional mood and stuff like that. Were those like was that one specifically like a personal project, I'm
Yeah.
assuming? Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Hmm.
Okay. And then actually, do you mind talking a little bit about how that came to be? Like what
Sure.
kind of triggered it? Yeah.
So this was a great example of someone who was a model who I thought had that very like kind of classic 40s, 50s aesthetic. And I was like, man, I want to put her kind of in this environment. How do I do this? And then how do well, initially I wasn't even thinking about like, how do I make a whole series out of it? It was really just like, let's find a place, like a physical place that we can use that kind of fits the aesthetic of this like 40s, World War II vibe. And then managed to find an Airbnb in town. Contacted them and they were like, yeah, would just give us the photos and you can use the place for a few hours. Which is great. If you live in a small city, this is a really great tip because
Mhm.
a lot of places will happily, like if they're rentals, like will happily exchange photos. Like you get some nice clean photos of their Airbnb they can put on their site, then they'll let you use it. Probably doesn't work in big markets like LA. I
Right.
don't think that's gonna fly, but yeah, pro tip if you're in a smaller area. And yeah, it was this like craftsman style house, which is pretty ubiquitous here in Portland. And came I think I might have visited, this was years ago, so I can't quite remember if I saw the images online or if I came to the space, but was able to kind of pre-visualize what the space looked like. Um, and then, kind of saw all these different rooms and it was like, well, I can't just shoot her in one room because, it's just got all of these beautiful spaces that I would love to take advantage of. And so then the story kind of started building from there. It's like, okay, well, we have this beautiful, like, kind of dining space. We have a gorgeous kitchen. The bedroom upstairs really pretty. The bathroom's amazing. Like, and I can't have her in the same wardrobe in all of these shots. And at that point, I was shooting a lot of like fashion editorial stuff. So it was, when you're shooting that, like you can't reuse your looks. So it's always like each different, scene has to have a different outfit. Um, so that's kind of how that sort of materialized. And then I think as we started pulling together wardrobe, I started thinking about, okay, well, what is she doing in these spaces? Like, what is she doing in this kitchen? She's pouring this cup of tea and she's over pouring it because she's a sad woman. Um, and what's her motivation for doing that? And why is she sad? And then, it's kind of this sort of iterative process where all of these things kind of start inspiring you piecemeal. And then eventually everything starts to connect
Mm.
and the narrative sort of evolves out of that. So, then we got some kids involved in the shoot, and then we got our male model involved in the shoot. So yeah, it kind of just sort of organically evolved, um, which is I would say fairly typical for the my narrative series and processes.
Okay. Okay. And then did you shoot, I'm assuming, like, I know obviously more shots than you use, but like, did you shoot any like scenes and then sort of pick your favorites to tell that story, like in the way that you presented it, like on your website and stuff? Or what were the
Yeah.
scenes pretty close to what you shot and then you just pared down your favorite images?
That was a project we're going in. I don't think I really had any preconceived ideas specifically on composition and what I wanted to get out of those images. Like I didn't go in and say, okay, she needs to be standing here because this needs to be framed this way. It was just kind of like, okay, we've got all of the elements together. How do we find in the moment the right story to tell in the right composition? Um, so that was a little bit more of that, you're in the space, you have all the pieces there, but let's experiment and let's see what happens.
Okay. Do you have certain photos or photo series that seem to resonate with people, like I guess like fan favorites or anything? Like is there anything that that comes to mind?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that one certainly does. And I think it has such a obviously it's like kind of a time specific piece, but I think the themes in the story that deal with the loss of a spouse or the loss of a loved one and being a mother that's now alone and like how you as that person are spending that alone time and what does that look like to you and how do you kind of live in those moments. I think those are themes that are, they're relevant beyond the specific narrative, right? um and so I think that that's always something that is important to me is like, okay, obviously, I'm gonna set this in some kind of time period and it's gonna be as beautiful as I can make it and like really romanticize it. But at the end of the day, the concept should still be relatable and classic and kind of transcend whatever the specific time frame of that narrative is. Um, so I think that one is definitely something that kind of people keep getting drawn to. I did a series called I call it Sisters Americana, and I shot that for a tutorial that I did on teaching color theory,
Okay.
um, which is interesting because the tutorial was about teaching color and using color in a space. But I think beyond that, the narrative that came out of that was really great. I think that the location itself was pretty incredible and lent itself to some really amazing imagery in and of itself. But this idea of these two sisters and their mom and their relationship. Again, like, it's kind of set in this sort of like 20s, 30s Dust Bowl Americana vibe. But, I mean, I have a sister, I have a strong relationship with my mom, and that was sort of a reflection of that, just kind of in a different style. And again, like the way that the characters interact within the narrative is not, it's not any different then than it is now.
Right.
Um, so yeah, I mean, those are the kind of stories that I think are sort of aesthetically rooted in a particular time frame, but thematically kind of
Mm.
transcend beyond that.
Do you find that you work personal things into your narratives like that? Or is that something that just kind of happens sort of unconsciously as you're just naturally creating?
For the sisters one, that was definitely an intentional
Okay.
thing. Um, but I also think that photography is a really great way for me to kind of experience things that I haven't lived through. And in some ways, it's almost like a form of empathy because you have to kind of put yourself into the perspective of that character and what they're going through and really kind of think about, if you were in this position, how would you respond and what would how would you react to certain things? Um, so I think, it's this way to sort of, yes, express your own experiences and kind of bring something to light through that. And I think you can't avoid that regardless, because there's always a part of you that's sort of intrinsically within the imagery. But it's also a way to kind of experiment emotionally and sort of put yourself into positions that you haven't been through. It's kind of like this what if, like what if I was, you know, what if I lost a spouse? How would I respond to that? Or, what if I was going through this thing?
Do you, so you're like, one of the things that I love about your imagery is sometimes you have to look at the picture for a while and just sort of take it in and sort of, it kind of requires you to be with it, which I think is awesome because some images, it's just, you can look at it for zero point 0.5 seconds and you understand the image. And a lot of what you do requires, some like digesting of it. How do you, I guess it's kind of a vague question, but how do you do that? Do you think a lot about, okay, if I do this way, people are going to have to sit with it and take it in, or is that just something that sort of spontaneously happens just because of who you are as an artist?
Well, I'm really glad that you said that, because that is something to me that it is really important. And I think especially in this day and age where everyone's just scrolling and you see or you see an image for like zero point 0.3 seconds. And like if I can get you initially, like if I can get you with the visual hook initially, and then get you to linger on it and do exactly that, and to sit with it and digest it, then to me that's a successful image. Um, and I think absolutely, like trying to get someone to linger just a little bit longer and put themselves kind of in the frame of mind of the character, or really try to like understand what's happening in the image is definitely something that's intentional. I'm not sure that it always happens the way that I want it to. Um, but yeah, I mean, like that's what draws me to art, I think, is like this sort of conceptual, ambiguous element.
Mm.
And I think for art to be powerful, it has to resonate with someone. And I think the more nebulous you make it, the more accessible it can be to a wider group of people, but their experience isn't necessarily going to be the same, if that
Mm.
makes sense. So I have like one example of this is I have an image that I shot in my old rental, and it's a nude woman lying in front of a fireplace, and she's facing away from camera, and there's a man in a suit, and he's got his arm reached out towards the front door. And people have all kinds of different interpretations of what is happening in that image. And what's fascinating to me is how men generally perceive it one way and women generally perceive it another way. And like, I'm like, that is amazing to me.
Yeah.
Like having those kind of responses, and having such variety in the types of responses and how people connect to it. And then how people connect based on their own experiences with relationships, right? Like if people have good relationships, they tend to have more of a positive response to the image. If people have had trauma in relationships, they tend to have more of a negative response. So I think like that to me is such a successful image, even if it's not, the most aesthetically interesting or the most like in your face, like wow, like kind of a hook of an image, but conceptually, like that is what I want to achieve with the imagery that I make.
Did you, so with ones like that, because I think that is a super good example, and I'm not asking you to describe what you were thinking when you shot it, because I think the mystery is super powerful, but did you have in your head, this is what I'm going for, or were you just like, I have this image and I'm just gonna leave it up to people and decide?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, because to to spill the beans, I guess, on that, I went in and we shot both of the talent in a bunch of different positions.
Okay.
I had him on the other side of the room. I had her facing camera. I had her at the door and him on the floor. And we just shot all these different permutations. And going into it, honestly, I was like, I don't know what the final image is going to be here. Um, and I didn't have the story in my head of what that was going to be, like what the final image was going to be. And having finished the image and published the image, I still don't like I can't tell you why that permutation was the one that kind of made the final cut. And that's just like I guess a gut thing. Like in the moment, I was like, maybe this is just aesthetically the most appealing. Um, but that's this interesting thing where it's like, what is the subconscious part of me gravitating to in
Mm-hmm.
this image? And I don't, quite frankly, don't think I have an answer for you.
Yeah.
But clearly there was something in my mind that,
Yeah.
was drawn to this as well. Um, so yeah, like there's when we talk about like imbuing part of you into your own art, I mean, I think that's a great example. And it doesn't have to be this like very prescribed conscious thing. It's just like, okay, this felt right when I
Mm.
did this.
Does that happen a lot to you in like the post-production process as you're culling and as you're sort of forming these final images and doing the post-production and stuff like that? Is it a very intuitive thing, or do you often ask yourself like a series of questions too as you're deciding what images to finish up?
I think it's become a lot more intuitive the more that I've done it. I think generally I my shooting process is I shoot, I download immediately. Within 24 hours, I've gone through and done kind of a first call while I'm still kind of in the headspace of the shoot. And then honestly, after that, I used to really like go through over and over and over again. And at this point, it's just kind of like I made these choices for a reason.
Yeah.
Unless like, unless it was, 3 o'clock in the morning and my brain was just all out of whack. Like that I generally trust my gut with that kind of initial pass. Um, and then just kind of whittle it down from there. But
Okay.
yeah, I mean it's mostly intuitive at this point.
Do
But
you
it
have
took time to get there.
yeah. Do you have a set sort of process might not be the right word, like sequence of actions that you take in the post-production process? So what I mean by that is, you cull the photos first and then you do lighting and again, I'm making this up. I have no clue, so I might sound completely ignorant to the photographic process, but like, do you have certain things you do in a certain order, or is the post-production like in the Photoshop work and the composite stuff and all the things that you're doing in post, do those happen in different order depending on what type of image that you're shooting?
It's very dependent, I would
Okay.
say. I probably shoot 50% in situ and 50% composite.
Mm,
Um, so if it's a composite process like that has its own workflow, and that is also dependent on whether or not I have a backplate already in mind for something, or if it's about the talent and then I have to go find or build a backplate that kind of works for that. So that's its whole process in and of itself. And then for stuff in situ, I mean, I think my general process is, import everything quickly, cull it down quickly, do general cleanup on images, jump straight into a color grade. Because for me, color is so critical in setting the emotion and the tone. So I need to know that the color is going to work for that image before it's even worth kind of
yeah.
getting into the nitty gritty of like the details and the polishing aspect of it. It's like, how can I get the emotion from the color grade first? And then we can worry about all of the details and the minutia.
This is a question I've always been curious about, and I've never actually asked anyone who does composite work. How in the world do you get the lighting to mix? Because, like, just for people who don't know what a composite is, right? It's when you're shooting something separate and then you're sort of merging the two photos together, right? Is that
Yeah.
essentially what's happening in it? So, how do you get the lighting to match? Are you having to be super meticulous with making sure the object that you're sort of merging with the source photo? Are you having to make sure the light source is like in the same spot and all that? Is it like hard, or do you have to do a lot? Is it like Photoshop or what? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think this is where like the engineering side of my brain comes into play quite a bit because it is really it's problem solving. So depending on which way you start, if you have a backplate first, you you understand the quality of light in the backlight, right? The sun is in a certain location, or the light in the room is on in this location. So you know the direction, you know the quality, and you know the color of the light. And those are kind of the main things that I'm looking for if I'm starting with a backplate. And then once you have all of that stuff, you can essentially recreate that in the studio. So, if it's bright directional like overhead sun, I'm going to put a light that is kind of emulating that, matching the color temperature with a gel, um, or with color balance, white balance in my camera. um, and then do I need to diffuse it, and if so, how much? And that's kind of like the general process of it. And then obviously there are other things like matching your lens. So like, is the background shot at a wide angle, or is it
Mm.
shot, at 100 millimeter lens, right? What height is the camera at? And making sure you're kind of matching all of those things. So it's like basically you're just trying to duplicate the background as if someone were in that space.
Okay.
Uh, so like conceptually, it's not that difficult, but making it actually work can be a lot more complicated than it sounds.
Yeah.
Um, and then you have the opposite, which I find more challenging, which is when you're photographing a person first, because
Mm.
then you have to build a backplate that out of existing imagery, or find something that works, where all of that stuff is already kind of aligned. And that stuff I think you don't have as much control over as you do with someone in a studio.
Yeah.
Um, and I've done it both ways, but yeah, it's like I love composite stuff because it is such a puzzle.
Yeah.
Um, and so there's like a problem solving aspect to that I find really interesting. And it also helps me keep my Photoshop skills sharp, because a lot of times, you don't get it totally right in camera. So then you have to learn all these kind of like trickery tools in Photoshop to get it to work, as best you can. So, um, but I love shooting that stuff, and I also love, the challenge of shooting someone in an existing location, and you're working with what you get, and you can't change the space, you can't make it deeper, you can't,
Right.
change what the ambient lighting in that space is. So both of them present their own challenges, but in very different ways.
Okay. Okay. What are one or two things that you do in your process that you think other photographers would find unorthodox?
I don't know if I would consider myself an orthodox photographer in any
Sure.
way.
Sure. Sure. Sure.
Um, yeah, I mean, I guess we talked about this a bit earlier, but just like changing it up all of the time and not sticking to any particular rubric when it comes to, the style that you're shooting, the type of lighting that you're shooting. Just like I like to just constantly be evolving aesthetically the types of story. So I think that most people, especially if they're working commercial photographers, kind of have carved out a niche for themselves,
Hmm.
and tend to sort of stay within that niche. Um, and there's value in that for sure. It's just not a way that I like to operate, because I think I would just get bored very quickly doing that.
Yeah.
Um, and then I think I there's a tactile quality to photography that's
Hmm.
like really interesting and important to me. So like being involved not just in the actual photography and the lighting side of things, but also like building sets and like making costumes, and like, just having kind of a physical tactile hand in the various aspects of the shoot. Whereas I think a lot of photographers just prefer to stick to the photography, which is totally fine. But
Yeah.
I've I've always been very much like I wanna get my hands on everything.
Where do you source your like so you were saying that like that closet behind you has all the different like, like outfits and stuff. Do you go out to like stores or like, all these different places and source them? I'm super curious about that too.
Yeah. So when I first moved to Portland, I found my first stylist that I absolutely love working with at a thrift store. And it was great because up to that point, I had been predominantly shopping myself. And some things are easy to find, if you're kind of shopping in the right vintage, you there's an abundance of stuff, and sometimes it can be really challenging if you're doing any kind of period stuff. So, um, thrift stores for sure. Etsy is great. It's on the pricier side typically, but if it's a concept that's worth doing, then it's worth spending the money to do it, I think. Um, I buy and return stuff on Amazon.
Yeah.
Um,
They make it so easy. You have to.
I know. Uh, yeah, no, I'd much rather support small businesses on Etsy, but sometimes you got to do what you got to do. But yeah, like I think that's a lot of stuff. And I think, being kind of in this world of creative uh the creative space for so long, you also make connections with boutiques and with stylists who can pull great things for you. So, having those relationships is really important too, to be able to source not just clothing, but also like resources to find really cool locations and access to interesting people. Building that community is really important.
When you're doing personal shoots, do you have to like invest a lot of your own money to hire those type of people to execute your shoots? Because I know with the commercial side, I would imagine you're getting, paid your certain amount and you can use that money to sort of hire whoever you need to do to execute the shoot and then hopefully, take a profit off that. But when you're doing your own stuff, um, does a lot of it require an investment too, or do you have a network and you kind of trade services with people? I'm kind of curious about that. Yeah, I've never thought
Yeah.
about it until you were outlining all the different people that you work with.
I am super fortunate that I have some really amazing people, both on the talent side and on the styling side, who are always willing to collaborate. And I think, no matter how long you've been doing this, no matter how much money you make doing this professionally, like there is a creative part of me that needs to be fulfilled outside of the work side of things.
Mhm.
And I've been fortunate to find like-minded people who, again, they've been doing this 10, 20, 30 years, but they love doing it. And oftentimes the fun stuff you don't really get to do in the commercial world.
Mm.
So personal projects for them and for me are opportunities to show off the skills that you have and do something that you can look at and be like, yeah, I'm really proud of that, because it's not something that, it's something that's beyond the scope of what is typically asked for in the commercial space. And I think it's really important that when I'm approaching these projects and contacting people, that expectations are set across the board, that this is a personal project. Like, you need to be able to get something out of it on your end. I try to work very collaboratively. I'm not a hair and makeup artist. I dabble in styling when I have to, but there are people who are incredible at doing that. They're incredible production designers. And what is so amazing about personal work is I can work with all of these people and they can bring something to the table that wouldn't even have thought of.
Mm.
Um, and that is their opportunity for them to shine. And I love that aspect, because collectively everything is elevated, right? It's like I have this idea, and yeah, maybe I came up with the concept, but they brought this amazing aspect to it, that really just like helps elevate the whole thing. And that's kind of the way that I like to work. And I think fortunately that attracts like-minded people who also really enjoy that collaborative experience and making stuff that just like we can all walk away proud of.
Do you think that as you were talking, that kind of reminds me of like how many people are involved in like a film, for example. You read the credits and there's these hundreds of
It's
people.
insane, yeah.
Do you feel like that, and maybe I'm like drawing sort of a just a conclusion just based off that alone, but do you feel like that helps make your work more cinematic? Is that you're drawing in these like experts from these certain, whether it's a stylist or, hair and makeup, like, do you feel that that takes it beyond what I guess the average photographer is capable of doing themselves?
It's an interesting question. Yes and no. I think that yes, bringing those people in and having those perspectives and those skills certainly add so much value and production value to the work. But I will say that for me, I've kind of made a career out of doing things that look expensive very cheaply.
Gotcha.
Um, so I think that's an important thing to consider as a photographer is like you can make high quality work, you can make things look expensive. Um, if you if you do it the right way, right?
Mm,
And you invest in certain things, right? Like if you have a really amazing model and idea, you don't have to have the most lavish background for your
mm,
space because you can tell a story in a space that isn't like, to the eye isn't all that exciting, but you can create so much emotion in the character's expressions or body language, or you can use lighting to completely transform what seems like a really basic space into something that like is totally transformed and looks really wild and wacky because it has crazy lighting in it. Um, so I do think that, having those people and having that community definitely helps bolster the quality of the work. And they're certainly, critical for my process, but I don't think it's a quality over a quantity thing. You don't
gotcha.
need a million people to make it all work. Now, if you're talking film, that's a different story because
Sure.
it's just a whole other animal. But in photography specifically, I think there's a lot that between a small crew and some decent Photoshop knowledge, you can make some pretty amazing looking stuff for not a lot of money.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Um, Getting into the inspiration side of things, I was super curious if you could sort of give us a glimpse of like some of the people who've inspired you over the years. So I was curious, let's go with three, unless you have more, you can feel free to share more, but three sort of visual artists, could be filmmakers, could be photographers, could be whatever, that you'd recommend that listeners, viewers check out. Maybe they've inspired you over the years, maybe there's people that you're whose work you're into now, but yeah, I'm just curious as to like some of the things that catch your eye.
So when I started out, I would say that I was very inspired by other photographers. Um, these days, I actually tried to stay away from looking too much in depth in other photographers' work because I feel like it starts to influence a lot of things, both from like the type of work that I should be doing, and then the whole like comparative thing. So
Hmm.
um, there's something off-putting, I think, about getting too fixated on other photographers and comparing yourself to them. So I tend to draw a lot of inspiration from other types of visual artists. I will say though that my absolute favorite photographer ever is a photographer named Rodney Smith, and his work is very, very different than mine. He's
Yeah.
predominantly a black and white natural light photographer, but he is was an absolute genius in terms of creating really simple but really whimsical and fun and classic and timeless imagery that there wasn't a lot to it in terms of what it was. He used a lot of like clean lines, a lot of like classic 50s styling. Um, but it's so whimsical and it's so fun, and it could have been taken 100 years ago and it could have been taken yesterday. And I think it totally transcends time and it does it in a way that's just so simple. And every time I look at an image of his, I'm like, damn, I wish I'd thought of that. Um, it's just brilliant. So yeah, Rodney Smith from a photography perspective, he's amazing. Um, from a cinematography perspective, I would recommend Andrei Tarkovsky. He was a Soviet director in the between like the 60s and the 80s. And we talked a bit before about like these kind of stills from a movie being a work of art in and of itself. And you could watch any of his films and pause it at any point, and that frame is it's just absolutely beautiful. A lot of his stuff is black and white too, but just compositionally, it's absolutely mesmerizing work. And I mean, there's so much amazing cinematography that I could pull inspiration from, but yeah, he's really incredible, and I think it's so well thought out what the composition was and what that means emotionally, and just yeah, it's just absolutely stunning. And then I'm super into kind of the early 20th century American painters, so like Andrew Wyeth or Edward Hopper. Um, there is like the Americana nostalgia aspect of it that I definitely gravitate to. I grew up in New England, so
Mhm.
like that kind of American history kind of thing has always, I don't know, it's always been like really fascinating to me. But like Edward Hopper specifically, it's just the colors are so amazing, a really like beautiful understanding of light and color and the interplay between them and how that works on like a psychological level. So yeah, like I think for me a lot of my inspiration kind of comes outside of the realm of photography. Um, but the things that I really like am drawn to are just really interesting concepts, color, any kind of color, and the composition.
Okay. I love that. Is there anything too that inspires you like architecturally? Like, is there certain styles of like building or nature even, like certain things that you feel drawn to from a scenic perspective?
Oh my God. Yeah. I actually have a master's degree in historic preservation.
Oh, cool.
So I am obsessed with all architecture. I wouldn't say that I have a favorite. I think that all historic architecture is beautiful and serves its purpose. And I would shoot every style of photography and try to create a story for each and every single one of them. Um, but yeah, I mean, photographing historic interiors is like one of my favorite things to do, and creating a story out of those historic interiors. When I lived in Philly, I owned a farmhouse that was built in the 1770s.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
But it was right at the beginning of my photography journey where I was like, I'm only going to shoot studio fashion photography. So I set up like a studio in this house, and I never shot anything inside the actual house. And it's
Oh,
like one of my absolute biggest regrets in
no.
life.
Dang it.
Uh,
Oh, yeah.
so now I have like a 1970s house, which like I'm trying to push it as far into like mid-century modern as I can and kind of shoot as much as I can within that space. It's very different aesthetic style, but
Sure.
yeah, architecture, like yeah, any kind of architecture, bring it on.
Okay, that's fascinating. I love that. Another question. So you've been doing this for, over 10 years. I'm super curious if you can think of any, maybe one or two sort of ideas that sort of like I would call them like game-changing ideas where that had a big impact on the way you approach your creative process or your approach to
Hmm.
photography. So like to give you an example of something like for me being a writer, something that blew my mind over the last year or two and like changed my creative process was realizing in the editing process, like not moving on from a single sentence before going to the next one when I'm editing, because I would always skip over things like, oh, I'll change that later. But sitting there
Hmm.
and being like, this sentence needs to be perfect. Okay, now I got that sentence. Now the next one. Like it's a simple thing, but it kind of changed my process. So I'm curious if there's anything that you can think of like that where, oh, wow, this way of looking at things changed everything for me.
Well, we talked about this a little bit, but I think I'd mentioned that recently I had started playing around with like Blender more. And I think that especially in my commercial work, that has really started to change my process and give me a lot more confidence into going into a commercial shoot, which tends to be a lot more structured and very much like this is what you've pitched to them, so now you have to execute it kind of exactly as you've pitched. Um, and so I think that has been a game changer in terms of helping me pre-visualize how I'm going to approach, particularly like set build kind of stuff, or if I have a location, being able to emulate that in Blender. Um, but it's kind of great to kind of mock up my lighting
Mm.
in Blender and kind of approximate where things need to be positioned within the space and light intensity and that kind of stuff. Um, so yeah, I think that's been really it certainly affected my process. I would say that I don't use it as much for personal work because I do want to allow myself more of that experimentation and like playfulness within my non-commercial side of things. Um, but yeah, I think that's been a more like kind of recent game changer in terms of process. And then going way back, I think the evolution of my photography career, I started off shooting landscape photography because I was living in New Zealand and the landscapes were amazing. And it was like, oh, let's take pictures so I can show people back home. And then when I moved back to the States, I was in Philadelphia, which has no mountains and no landscapes. So I was like, okay, I'm going to pivot. I'm going to shoot something different. So then I started photographing people. And so for like 5 years, it was kind of this like very um, dual approach to photography with very little crossover. And then I think when I discovered composite photography, that was a
Mm.
massive game changer because it allowed me to bring those two things together. Um, and opened up a lot of creative opportunities and ways to kind of introduce more conceptual elements and build things that didn't really, or couldn't exist in the same space at the same time. Um, so yeah, I think like fundamentally, like the discovery of composite photography and then the use of, this kind of 3D previs technology in more recent years have been kind of, I would say, pretty big game changers in terms of my process.
That makes a ton of sense. I remember when I first learned about composites, I was like, that's how they do that. You know what I mean? Like, I had no clue that was a thing, just not being super deep in the photography world. And when I saw that, it was like, oh, that's super cool.
Yeah,
But
well, and it starts off too where it's like, okay, you have a backlight and you have a person and you put those two things together. And then once you can do that, you're like, oh, I can build whatever I want. I
mhm.
can add this, I can add these two landscapes together. And then all of a sudden, like all of these doors and opportunities are open to you that you wouldn't have considered before.
And yeah, it adds up like, and it opens up the door of like surrealism and
Totally.
certain things that, yeah, that would be utterly impossible or extremely expensive to shoot.
Yeah. I mean, no model wants to be woken at 3 o'clock in the morning and dragged up the hill for a sunrise shot. But I'm happy to do that. Like I'll go hike for a sunrise shot and be sweaty and gross, but I'm not going to schlep a model up the hill to do that. So they can stay in a nice, comfortable studio environment while I put in the work.
That is genius. I never thought about it from that perspective, but that makes a ton of sense. So the last question I have, I think this is a good place to wrap it up. What do you hope people think, feel, experience when they come into contact with your work? Do you have sort of things that you hope people would experience?
I think the first thing I want them to think is WTF. I'm somewhat kidding, but I'm somewhat not because I think
Yeah.
like that moment of like what am I looking at? Like what's happening here is like a great hook. And like that's the stuff to me that's interesting in art. That's like those kind of like TV shows or movies or things that like always catch my attention and keep me wanting to come back for more. So if I can do that in my work, um, that's successful. And I think I know that everything's been done before a million times, but if I can do something in a way that's slightly different or has my kind of spin on it, or someone can see it and say, oh, I hadn't thought about it this way, or that's an interesting interpretation. I think um, that's what I want people to experience.